Okay, so our discussion today, what color is the wall behind you? For those of you at home, don't look behind you. Maybe you're at your house and you probably already know, but try to remember what the color is and then wonder if you actually remembered or if you're just guessing. And then if for people at home, probably didn't walk by the statue, but think about something random in your environment you might have noticed, might not have. So for us, what is the color of the flower vase on the George Mason statue today? We'll get to why that's an interesting question in 1 second. How reliable is memory, and how reliable is your own memory compared to others? Okay, so what color was the wall behind you? White. Okay. How many of you actually remembered that? Okay. You think you, or did you look around the room and say, color of the walls are white? No, nothing. Okay. Well, a lot of times people have this question in other settings, and it's basically like it's something so mundane that's in the background that you might have seen it before, you might have interacted with it before, but it's not something that sticks in your mind because it's just not that useful of information, so you gloss over it. What color was the flower vase by the George Mason statue? Does anybody remember? Nobody. Oh, nobody walked by it? Okay. Well, that's an interesting question. I was hoping somebody would say something because it's a total lie. There's no vase there. I just wanted to see if something would come up. Yeah, I was just one of those random questions. I was trying to see if anybody would give me a color that they were guessing or thinking that they saw it. So we're going to talk a little bit about false memory today and a flower suggestion. Maybe me saying that could have prompted you to think that you did see a flower vase and like, oh, maybe I think it was red. Maybe that's a typical color for a vase, that kind of thing. And then how reliable is your memory? Who has something to say? Mm-hmm. So now you're aware of that, though.
Oh, I'm aware that my memory is terrible. So if you're not going to remind me names, or I tell people you don't have to remind me this later, like you have to remember something you told me right now.
Yeah, that's a good thing to know about yourself because you yeah. So you're using your environment to aid in your natural memory. Yeah. Well, it's not memory. Mm-hmm.
I think you're really
Sad. So we need to scare you and make you upset today rather than make you So it may be false in that maybe when you were taking in all the information, something in your might be or what left you. But that's a great point with the smell, because that's a cue. Well, we talked a little bit about that at the end of chapter 6. Basically that, especially smells are really close to your different parts of your brain that like are really useful in our memory. So it's a thing like when you have that experience, when you have that event, you have that smell, and then so those memories are kept together, and that smell is how you live that event. So it's pretty fun.
There's no studies where it said like the sense of smell is like your
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, you'll find lots of studies on that kind of thing. But smell is, yeah, really powerful. I'm sure you all can have that experience, like a childhood smell or different things, and it's like, it really takes you back to that moment. Like, who likes to smell books? Is anybody a book sniffer? Yeah, books are nice. There was an article, it was like I don't know, rocks or something like that. It was a while ago, but basically, like, some chemists like broke down all of the like chemicals that were responsible for the book smell, and it's like really complicated. It's basically like some of the bleaches and some of the dyes that are used, plus like specific molds in specific areas. So there's a lot of complex stuff there, but it gives you that really nice aroma of knowledge, right? Okay, so just a couple of notes. You probably saw the email, the paper is extended. The deadline is now April 7th because it's taking me a little time to get back to you guys. So you got an extra week. Your exam 2 is extended to the 23rd. And then if you are in a group of people who didn't get a response about your paper from me until after the 12th, then your deadline is now extended a week after that. Just having some personal stuff, and it was interfering with my ability to be prompt, so I'm sorry about that. Trying to make things fair. And just, if you ever feel like I'm ignoring you, I probably missed you, so just bother me again. Or don't, I mean, not bother me, but email me again. I want to get back to you. Just, you can poke me, it's fine. It's good, so we all kind of are fair. Oh, here's an interesting thing. I thought it was interesting and sad a little bit. Anyway, so one student was emailing me about the paper. It's a good one, who it was. But you know how I sent out those announcements through Blackboard saying, see above, like basically like discussion is posted. So that's the title of the announcement, and then the body message is just see above and like a smiley face. So one student sent their paper approval to me and got that as a response, like something through the system. It just said see above, and then it did it again. So it was like, it looked like I was just totally ignoring them and writing see above, and I thought it was kind of funny. I found that email chain. Um, so if you ever feel like I'm giving you a really weird dismissive thing, check the title and like if it was sent by Blackboard, because I'm not sure why it gave that mistake, but it was one of those um, embarrassing incidents where it just seemed like that would be a really rude thing for me to do. So I was like, oh, I'm sorry. That was not my intention at all. Um, so today we are talking about everyday memory and errors in everyday memory. So on the agenda, talking about prospective memory and autobiographical memory. So in those categories, how do we remember things we need to do later, perspective memory, and what events do people remember over their entire lifespan, the autobiographical memory, how are memories created, so how do we create memories by combining what happened with creative mental processes, causes for memory error, what kind of things can cause distortions in our memory, and then some practical implications. So what does memory research tell us about errors in eyewitness testimonies? People brought that up. And about remembering traumatic events. It's an interesting topic at the end of your chapter. So perspective memory. So perspective memory is remembering what we need to do. So it's memory of things that haven't happened yet. So you're remembering that you need to perform intended actions, like going to class, taking your books to school, writing in your agenda, submitting applications. You know that you need to do these things, you remember that you need to do these things, but obviously they haven't happened yet, so it's the prospect of remembering those things. So you can remember what you want to do, and you can remember to do it at the right time. So there's also implications of what you need to be reminded of, or how you can remind yourself of certain things. We all don't want to miss tasks. We all want to have that prospect. We want to reliably do all the things that we intend to do, and sometimes we fail to do these things. I know I'm guilty of that. So here's a study that's just a little practical advice for you. Familiar cues like having an email notification the same way versus something that's unfamiliar, so having like your cues buried up. Um, if you have similar cues all the time, your percent of correct responses kind of goes down, so it's like it stops being so cueing to you at some point. So unfamiliar cues are more effective than familiar ones. So you could think, I think this study used friends versus strangers telling them information. So cue words are presented words versus non-words. Familiar cues distracted from the message itself. And then event-based and time-based is right here. So event versus time-based tasks makes a little sense. The event-based task is that you know, or it's the event that itself is happening. So whenever a particular event happens, it cues you, it triggers you to perform whatever action, or you can have time-based, so you need to perform a certain action at a certain time, like take your medication at a certain time. But the problem with time-based, we don't necessarily always have a perfect internal clock. We might forget what time it is, or not look at the clock at that time. We might have other things going on. So the solution for having time dependent or time based perspective memory is often to turn it into an event based cue or an event based task, in that you set an alarm for yourself. So now instead of time, you are responding to hearing that alarm. So autobiographical memory, what has happened in your life? So episodes can be remembered from two different perspectives, and this kind of changes over time. So there's a field perspective. So you remember the event as if you're actually like seeing through your eyes, first person viewing that event, or an observer point of view. So you're remembering an event as if somebody else was seeing it. So you've got even you in the frame, and you're seeing it kind of from behind. And what they find is basically that recent memories are often seen from that field perspective. So you in that position, seeing through your eyes what's going on, versus remote memories are seen from an observer perspective. So here's a little picture showing what we mean by field and observer perspective. So in this case, you are in that right picture, you're that person holding up your hand waiting. So in the image on the left, you're seeing through your eyes. You're seeing what's going on. Versus over time, you kind of switch to the point of view that you are yourself in the scene, that you're remembering it. So you pull your kind of vision back, and you see yourself in that field. So it's kind of the observer perspective. So this is kind of how many of you kind of dream in first person versus third person, like observer perspective? Does anybody ever have that? What's that? You switch between them? How do you switch? You're always first person? Interesting. I switch too. So how about anybody else? Third person ever? How many people dream in color? Yes, so some people, their dreams are only in black and white ever, which I think is interesting. Some people have very vivid dreams, some people have dreams in color. Who's ever a different person in their dreams? Yeah? It's annoying, isn't it? Like, sometimes I'm switching between, like, there's people in a scene, sometimes I'm this person, and then I switch to another person. Yeah, yeah. Does anybody else have that? it looks different, but it's always the same one.
Yeah, it's always the same, different house. Like, it isn't the one I have, but I know where it is my house is always from. Like, I know I have.
I mean, I think your that one's pretty cool. Do you ever have like the memories of another person? Like, do you ever remember that other person knew that you knew, but you have memories of somebody else's looking characters like? Yeah.
But it's just a story, and actually, it's kind of a long profile, and not anything.
Mm-hmm. So it's just, yeah, it's like your mind's constructing these new things, and you're kind of putting all these different actors. I think once or twice. Do you have that a lot?
Constantly.
Yeah. It's like your mind is a continuing television series.
I have two recurring dreams. I have created two separate worlds in my head, basically.
And sometimes it's.
They're not fast.
Mm.
Like I had a recurring dream when I was drowning, and eventually I woke up in Vergil's. So I no longer drown in my dreams.
That's really cool. It's like your adaptation towards that dream confrontation. Yeah.
And then after my grandpa passed away when I was 14, I had dreams about the funeral, even before the funeral happened. And then eventually I had dreams where I brought him back to life.
Mhm.
And now when I would see him in my dreams, he never died. So it's so weird.
Yeah. So it's continuing. That's cool though, and you have that memory of those dreams. A lot of people don't remember their dreams as well, which I find interesting.
So those are the two worlds I've created in my head, if you guys don't think I'm insane.
No, you're not. You were speaking about crossover, and this is totally tangential. Did you guys, who's seen 21 Jump Street and Men in Black? They're going to do a crossover between Men in Black and 21 Jump Street. It's really exciting. It should be pretty exciting. I hope you guys like it. They haven't started making it yet, but it's confirmed. So at some point. So our memories over our lifespan, that's what our biographical memories are. But what are really the events that stand out, that are remembered later in our lives? Often it's going to be personal milestones, strong emotional events, significant events, like the day you got into college, or the day you graduated, or even losses in members of the family, that kind of thing. And transitional events. So these are kind of the things that make up sort of these points in our lives that you say, who am I? Well, I remember these particular series of moments, and they sort of make up my autobiographical self. So this is kind of interesting. It's called the reminiscence bump. Um, so so in kind of the typical experience of people within whatever culture, your memory in people above 40, they have this sort of peak looking graph of the percentage of memories that they have. So if you look at the graph, it sort of peaks at about 20. So your life up until you're about 20, you're remembering a lot of your life events kind of at that point, and then it tapers off, and then you're going to remember things that are most recently happening to you. But basically, like, your autobiographical self is most active when you're about 20 for kind of more typical cases. So memory's high for the recent events, events for adolescence, and for events in early adulthood. So there are hypotheses for why this is, because it's kind of weird, right? Kind of surprising. But why is this? So it could be that your life narrative has a lot to do with these things, these pivotal changes in your life at that point. So people build their identities most during the time that they become an adult and are making these decisions that lead to who we eventually think of ourselves in the long run. Cognitive processes, so encoding is better in times of rapid change, followed by stability. So it could just be that your mind is really active at this time because things are changing rapidly for you. Um, could also be a cultural life script, so events that are that commonly occur in one culture happen in that bump. So basically, that when you're staying in one culture kind of throughout your life, like that's the point in your life when things are mostly changing. So this is a little interesting, gets to that last part, that cultural thing. So if you study people who've ever immigrated, their reminiscence bump is actually different than typical cases. So people that immigrated when they were 20 to 24, their bump peaks at about 15 to that point, so right before they kind of had that immigration. Maybe there was so much going on and they were getting used to new things that um, they didn't have that strong part of their identity and they were remembering how it was beforehand, that kind of thing. And then you've also got people who immigrated at 35. Um, so that you can see that peak is kind of weird as well. So there might be just differences in why at that age. You've got the peak at about that 34. Maybe you're more of an adult at that point and you make the decisions that are, critical life events that are leading to that. But it's sort of interesting that we have this normal shape that's observed for a lot of different people, but that process of changing your cultural identity or changing where you are changes your life script enough that it makes your memory, makes your percentage of what you remember best different. Kind of cool, right? So here's just a little table to summarize it. So explanations for the reminiscence bump. So your life narrative, periods of assuming a person's life identity, cognitive, so encoding is better during these periods of rapid change, and your cultural life script, culturally shared expectations structure your recall. So who's heard of flashbulb memories? Probably we all really have. So the idea behind a flashbulb memory is that in a really shocking life or cultural experience event, your mind kind of takes a snapshot of your entire environment right when you heard that really shocking, powerful emotional event, and that you keep that like a picture in your mind. It's highly memorable. So scientists wanted to kind of know if that was actually true. So the hypothesis is that you will remember that flashbulb so much better than normal life events, just because it's so shocking at that point. But you can have that hypothesis, and that's cool, but you really need to find a way to test it. So there were people who started doing these studies where basically they would ask people of that flashbulb memory right after, and then a couple years later we're able to interview those same people. So who knows what the Challenger explosion is? Yeah, it was. Does anybody want to say? Samara, it kind of looked like you were gonna. Yeah, I think this is right. It was. Don't correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it that there was a malfunction in the way that the heat shield was rated on the shuttle? Um, the owner. Okay. Yeah. So you remember you had that flashbulb? Yeah. It was so shocking because no space mission so there were problems kind of on launch pads, but there was never something to this kind of caliber. Yeah, so Apollo 1 wasn't affected. They had only oxygen in the shuttle at that point in time. Oxygen's really flammable, So they want a lot of oxygen, so when they're on space, they have that, access to that. But what happened, we were on the launch pad and there was a fire within the capsule and everybody burned to death and suffocated because there was so much oxygen and it combusted really quickly. You have these really fine electrical panels and different things, so it was something that people should have thought of and did not. But basically, this was a lot more shocking because it was really the first time that, like, there was that level of catastrophe within a space program. We were all so sure of ourselves, like, we made it to the moon, yay, like, we have this space thing under control, and then this happened. But yeah, and 9/11 is another one that we all probably remember better because it happened more recently. I wasn't born yet for Challenger, but here's an example of one of these people that was surveyed for this flashbulb memory. So shortly after it happened, this is what they remembered. I was in my religion class and some people walked in and started talking about it. I didn't know any details except that it had exploded and the school teacher's students had all been watching, which I thought was so sad. Then after class, I went to my room and watched the TV program talking about it, and I got all of the details from that. So that was the true memory right after the event, that flashbulb. But two and a half years later, when asked again, when I first heard about the explosion, I was sitting in my freshman dorm room with my roommate, and we were watching TV. It came on the news. It came on a news flash, and we were both totally shocked. I was really upset, and I went upstairs to talk to a friend of mine, and then I called my parents. So as you can see, that case, it did not quite hold up. Their flashbulb, what was supposed to be so stuck in their memory and would never fade, has totally changed in this case. And you find that with a lot of other studies as well, that in fact, that flashbulb memory is also capable of decaying over time and becoming changed over time. So on the figure on the left, we have this actual study of the number of details remembered from your everyday experience and a flashbulb memory. So as you can see, they both decline. And then on the right, we actually have our belief that we remember it accurately. And in this case, our flashbulb memory, we still believe that we accurately remember it. Versus how much we actually remember. So it shows that instead of maybe a flashbulb memory, our confidence of our memory at that point is really what's responsible for our hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and between. So yeah, your mind was still developing at the time. You were exposed to different things. You didn't necessarily know how to process because it's such a weird thing that doesn't happen. So yeah, that was right. And that kind of memory bump, right? If you were about to try and try to remember those events more clearly at that time too. But so that's interesting. Have we kind of heard about flashbulb? Some of you said you kind of heard about flashbulb before. Is this a little surprising that in fact it's not necessarily a true? You know already. It could have been also at this time, everybody had their televisions on, right? We were all watching the news kind of constantly. So when we turned the televisions on, and this actually is a too. A lot of people report that they heard things from the television first, and over time you get more belief that you did hear it from the television first. And that's where we get a lot of our information. It's also like you heard the story over and over and over again at that time with a lot of these big news events. So what is this one? So basically, everyday memory verse, our flashbulb memory again. So there was this congruency score. Basically, they rated things like the percentage of these statements that they remember really clearly. Let me look at this one in the book. Percentage remembered anything about the event. Basically, that we blow. This is discussed in your book a little bit, but same kind of idea. We blow it out of proportion how much we think that we actually remembered the event, even though we didn't necessarily remember a lot about it. Yeah, and in this study as well, people were kind of cued, so they were told to remember certain things, whereas in another one they didn't. So this one provides a little bit of evidence that maybe there is something going on with this flashbulb memory concept, but there's a little bit of, I guess, uncertainty in the field, and there is evidence contrary to it. So you'll still hear about the concept of flashbulb memory, but yeah, don't necessarily buy it entirely. But here's a little bit of reasoning for why we might think about the flashbulb memory. Even if we don't remember everything perfectly, we remember that the event occurred for sure, because it's highly emotional typically, and our amygdala is really involved. So these events that have high emotional valence trigger activity in the amygdala, and that itself, that high emotionality, can lead to better recall. So that's some evidence maybe for it in our brains. Remember, kind of from last time, things that are transferred into long-term memory might have some connection to just that highly emotional component, because just these areas are related to memory anyway. And then there's also the rehearsal of it. Again, like, we heard the event and we heard details about the event, but we were also asked over and over and over again, where were you when this happened? What did you see when this happened? What class were you in? Whatever. It was on the TV. Keep hearing this over and over again. So this is kind of that rehearsal of the details of the event. In that rehearsal, maybe things get mutated and you remember some of these false things that never actually happened. But you know, if you're rehearsing it over and over again, you're still going to be more likely to remember details about it. So this kind of gets into construction of memory. So we want to think that our memory is just totally based off of what happened and not other factors influencing us. But people's memories are, we have a series of studies we'll go through. Basically, it's not perfectly those events. Things bias your ability to remember things, the details that you do remember, the way that you think about kind of what's going on, and that influences the actual knowledge that's stored in your brain and eventually what you say you remember about it. So it might be your additional knowledge about whatever's going on, your experiences, and your expectations of the information that you're seeing. So here's talked about a little bit in your book, people's inflation of what their grades were much later. So when you're remembering the grades you got, say in high school, you infer sort of that concept of how many grades or what your grades were based on, I think I did pretty well in school. So a lot of people, so students had accurately remembered A grades 89% of the time, so they're more likely to remember that than D grades only 29% of the time. And also 79% of 99 students in this study inflated their grades by remembering some of them as being higher than what they actually received. So instead of remembering the accurate events, the real information that's coming in, you kind of remember these positive events more than you remember the negative ones. And you also remember sort of generally you performed well in school, you liked school. So that leads to you having this false conception about your actual performance and inflating those grades. Same with this. This is an interesting kind of study. Being exposed to something over and over can lead to this source monitoring error. So in this study, people were read a list of names, just random names, non-famous people, and then they were immediately tested. So they read once they read the names from acquisition, they added new non-famous names into what the person was presented with, and they were asked which ones were famous. So most non-famous names were correctly identified as non-famous. So they were pretty good at distinguishing and saying, no, I don't think that name is famous. But after 24 hours, the result is that they were given that same test, but the number of names that were assumed to be famous increased. So some of the non-famous names were misidentified as famous ones. It's because they were exposed to that information the last time they took that test, and it was that concept of famous or not famous. So later on, when they were tested again, it created that false conception that these names were in fact famous when they weren't. So that tells you just a little bit about you think the source in this case would be your actual knowledge of these names. Are these names famous or not? Do you have the memory of such a thing? In the initial case, you identify that no, they were not famous names, but in the second instance, instead of monitoring if you actually remember the names or not, you remember that you were tested on the names before, and that leads you to mistakenly think that they were famous names when it was just made up in the study. There's also inferences that we make. So basically, things that would make sense to us, we make little switches in our mind that technically makes our memory more inaccurate, but there's reasons why we do such a thing. So the children's snowman vanished when the temperature reached 80. The flimsy shelf weakened under the weight of the books. The absent-minded professor didn't have his car keys. The karate champion hit the cinder block. The new baby stayed awake all night. So participants were read that list, but what they eventually remembered was the children's snowman melted overnight, or when the temperature reached 80. So changing this word that was presented in the sentence to a word that made more sense. So you infer that this is the phenomenon that's happening, this is a better word for it, so the memory is replaced with this other thing. So weakened became collapsed, didn't have became lost, hit became broke or smashed, and stayed awake became cried. Just because that's what we would expect in these scenarios, it leads us to change our mind from the actual meaning of the sentences, the actual meaning of the words to, or the actual presentation of the words to what we think the meaning is more accurately described. So, pragmatic inferences. Here's another example, sort of a study about that. So in the experimental group, participants were exposed to John was trying to fix the birdhouse. He was pounding the nail when his father came out to watch him and help him do the work. In the control group, John was trying to fix the birdhouse. He was looking for the nail when his father came out to watch him and help him do the work. So in both cases, we infer that John was using a hammer, but the hammer was never explicitly mentioned in either one. In the experimental group, he was pounding. He assumed he was pounding with a hammer. In the control group, he was just looking for the nail. So it's related to the hammer, but it doesn't. But in the first case, in the experimental group, one would assume he was using the hammer, which led people to erroneously states that he was using the hammer more often. So in the experimental group, when presented with, "Have you seen this sentence?" a sentence referring to a hammer, 57% said that they had seen that, versus the control group, when presented with that sentence, even though it was related to the hammer, it was less so him using the hammer. So it basically shows that you can construct these false memories, but the meaning of what's going on will influence your construction of that thing. So schemas, this idea of schemas, also influences the way that we remember things. So our schemas are basically our mental representation or knowledge about how things fit together. So like your mental filing cabinet of certain things. Like we know that hammers go with nails, etc. So in this experiment, participants were invited to experiment and had to wait in an office. So during the experiment, they were asked to describe the office that they had waited in, and then participants wrote down things that they explicitly remembered that they saw in the office, but also items that were usually found in the office. Let's see if there's a picture of that. There's a picture in your book. They were asked to wait in this office. There were no actual books on the shelves, but there were bookshelves and other various things that your understanding of what an office typically holds influenced what people remembered. So they falsely remembered that there were books in the office when there were none, etc. So you find that typically your assumption of what should be present is our minds fill in that gap in our memories and put those things there even though they were not there. Same with a script. So a schema is kind of what's put together. A script is sort of the way things are strung together, especially events. So in this study, participants were exposed to small paragraphs such as, "The dentist, Bill had a bad toothache. It seemed like forever before he finally arrived at the dentist's office. Bill looked around at various dental posters on the wall. Finally, the dental hygienist checked and x-rays his teeth. He wondered what the dentist was doing. The dentist said that Bill had a lot of cavities. As soon as he'd made another appointment, he left the dentist's office." So participants will read this sentence and they know what's kind of involved in going to the dentist. So they created stories that included material that matched the story, but also material that wasn't presented in the story that was described. So it says nothing about checking in this paragraph. It doesn't say anything about checked in with the front desk or wrote his name down, but people falsely remembered that instance just because that's what's involved in the script of going to a doctor or going to a dentist. Excuse me. So our memories are influenced by sort of what we think should be there. Our minds fill in the gaps as it sees fit. So this is not necessarily a bad thing, although it can be, but this reflects the nature of the human mental process as creative. So we want to not just passively observe what's going on, but if you remember from before, even synthesizing material, creating expectations and judgments helps us to remember information better. So our mental process is, in fact, creative itself. This construction of memories will lead to errors, but it also helps us to fill in the blanks of things that we can't consciously be attending to. For instance, when you walked in the door and I asked you what color the wall was behind you, a lot of people probably said white. You might have remembered it, you might not have. You might even think that you remembered it and not saying anything. You have your own memories, but basically, you know there's a wall there even though you're not paying much attention to it, just because your understanding of buildings, there are walls behind you. It's so bland and unimportant of information that it's just going to be in the background and your mind's going to fill in the blank, but that's fine. We don't need to pay attention to everything because it could lead to overload, that you're perceiving everything at the same time. Remember, we have that limited attentional capacity, limited ability to understand what's going on, so why would we pay attention to boring, useless information when we could be paying attention to more exciting, more dangerous, or fun, or better information, basically. So filling in the gaps can lead to our avoiding of this overload, so just assuming what's there and moving on. So it helps us know what we need for sufficient functioning, that constructive nature of memory, because we know sort of what's going on around us. For instance, your script, you remember that script of what should be happening. So it helps you to kind of remember those steps that you need to follow through with. So again, memory is not perfect, and it can be created and modified just by suggestion. So it's kind of that question I asked you, what color was the vase on the Mason statue today, which nobody fell victim to. Sadly, I was hoping somebody would tell me that it was a color when in fact there was no vase, but what I was trying to do is suggest to you some false memory and see if I could make you think that you remembered that. But there are a lot of different studies that involve um, this type of deception to see what kind of occurs. So here is an experiment where participants were seen, I think, either just an image or a series of images, basically something like a car crash in this experiment. So they saw this car crash, but there were things that they did not see. For instance, there's no cracked glass. The image in the background is a stop sign, but when they were asked questions about this, they didn't see the image anymore, and they were asked, like, what happened with the shattering glass, even though this was false. Some participants even reported hearing glass shattering. So they said that, oh yeah, the glass shattered. I remember this going on. Or mentioning, did you see the yield sign in the background? Oh yeah, I saw the yield sign, when in fact it's a stop sign. So suggesting this type of information when your mind is able to fill in the background can lead to, so I can predispose you to create false memories. Mm-hmm.
Versus using non-leading questions where they just showed them like pictures on a piece of paper and it was like, did you see a red ball or did you see the ball?
Mm-hmm.
So people who read it answer falsely to a leading question versus a non-leading question.
Absolutely. The red ball would be leading, right? Yeah. Just like saying, did you see the vase? Or did you see a vase on the statue? Yeah, but this is really interesting for different things. Definitely eyewitness testimony, but also if any of you conduct surveys, people can be really influenced without their knowledge, and it's important to account for that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's we know this, right, as psychologists, but it's still being used. Isn't that the sad thing? Like these are totally horrible, bad science, but they actually affect people's lives. Innocent people go to jail. Innocent people even get put to death because of eyewitness testimony that's totally unfair. A lot of you saw that the show Making a Murderer, right? You were talking about Making a Murderer, yeah, Murderer. Yeah, so famously the first case was that a woman was brutally attacked on a beach, and police officers in the area really in fact, intentionally led the victim to falsely identify this man, Stephen Avery, as the perpetrator when he was it was obvious that he wasn't around. He had an alibi, and yeah, there was a lot of stuff. And she said, yes, that was definitely the guy that did it, but in fact, it wasn't because she was led to think that way. We'll get more into that in a second too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Which is why it's so scary. Yeah, well, I mean that was a big theme in the show is that they not only were they making mistakes, they intentionally made these mistakes because they had it out for this person, which is interesting, right? So memory by suggestion explanations for our misinterpretation. So the memory trace replacement hypothesis. So this is misleading post-event information. Basically, you have that event, you see whatever information, you have that stimuli, and afterwards you're presented with this misleading post-information or post-event information. That would be my suggesting to you that there was a yield sign in the background when in fact it was a stop sign. So that interferes with your ability to recognize the stop sign. So MPI, misleading post-event information. So explanations for this: misleading post-event information can impair or replace the actual memories that were formed during the original experience of an event. The original information is not remembered because of retroactive interference. So basically, this new information changes what you retroactively saw, or retroactively interferes with what you saw in the past, which occurs when most recent learning interferes with memory of something that happened in the past, all related. And then source monitoring, again, we kind of talked about, a person incorrectly concludes that the source of their memory for the incorrect event. So you're thinking about what happened, and instead of referring to what you actually saw, you're referring to what was suggested to you. In that slideshow of the crashes, even though the actual source was the experimenter's statement, you incorrectly think that it happened, that it was what you were presented with in the experiment, that image of the stop sign. So those are just suggested explanations for why this happened. So in another study, participants, let's see, man stealing money in a computer. So in this experiment, people saw a scene and they heard a female narrator telling them instances about this event. So they saw those things together, and then then afterwards, the event itself, or the images were removed, but they heard the woman's voice again repeating the same thing that happened. A day later, they come back and they don't see the images at all, but they hear again the female voice, but this time there are details that are switched in the event. So they hear just about the same story, but with little differences. And so the percent of suggested responses, that was the first condition, of this experiment. And another condition of this experiment, the same thing happened on the first day. They see the events and they hear the female voice. The next day they would hear the same thing that the female voice would say, but now it's a male voice. So basically the effect is, if you're hearing the same voice kind of tell you this misleading information, or this next time, it can create kind of that false memory more than if you change the mode, basically. So that you can kind of see. So misled, I don't really like this figure very much, but it's described a little better in your book. So in the first case, you can see that there's a really high percent of recall of these suggested things in the misled versus the control, where, in the control they didn't hear anything fake. Yeah, it's described a little better in your book. I think I'm doing a bad job. But the takeaway message from this is basically that if you're hearing the same kind of person saying it, or you're exposed to the same type of environment, that can influence the creation of false memories, whereas if it's coming from sort of a different position. So a little bit of explanations for the misinformation effects, just in a table form. Memory trace replacement, so misleading post-event information can replace your original memory, so it can create a retroactive interference, so misleading post-event information but does not eliminate, or it interferes with the original memory. So it might not completely remove it, but you have kind of problem distinguishing between the two. And then a source monitoring error where you misidentify the input of that information. So instead of looking back at the actual image that you saw, you're looking back to that post event, that misleading post event information, but inaccurately concluding that it came from the original source. So here's an experiment where the experimenters actually influenced what people remembered from their early lives. So created false memories in an experiment, created false memories of these people's pasts. So it's kind of interesting and a little maybe scary at the same time. So in this experiment, false events are remembered as real events because of the familiarity of speaking about them. So participants were asked about important events in their lives. Additionally, they were presented with false information about these events, and participants were asked about these events a couple of days later. So here's an example where the participants, where it's described in the book, one participant was talking about a wedding that they went to when they were a child. They were presented with this passage, basically, when you were a child and you were at that wedding, you were running around with somebody crazy and you knocked over a punch bowl. So that was completely told to them, and they say, no, I don't remember that at all. I don't think that happened. And it's like, okay. And a couple days later, they asked them again about that wedding. And even though originally they said that, no, they had no recollection of that happening, in this example, the person totally took that fake memory, totally now thinks of it as their own. So the wedding was my best friend in Spokane. Her older brother, was getting married, and it was over here in P. Washington, because that's where her family was from. And it was in the summer or the spring because it was really hot outside and it was right on the water. It was an outdoor wedding, and I think we were running around and knocked something over, like a punch bowl or something, and it made a big mess and, of course, got yelled at. So in the original case, they were presented with something about this wedding. So the participant said, I don't remember anything about this. They said to them, oh yeah, you were in this area, you were running around and you knocked over a punch bowl. A couple of days later, that person totally thinks that that's a true memory of their past. True story. And finally, eyewitness testimony. So we've heard, and you're all aware of, and we're going to become more aware of the fact that eyewitness identification is very flawed, but still 200 people per day in the United States become criminal defendants based on their eyewitness testimony. So still a lot of people are coming out in court and trying to, or becoming a testifier, like saying I have information on this that should put this person away or get this person off of whatever, even though that's probably a bad idea entirely. So in many cases, errors in the eyewitness testimony have resulted in conviction of innocent people. The assumption that people see and report things accurately, as we know, is false. But memory is not like a camera. Basically, again, we think that we're going to remember these things accurately. We don't. Treating it as though we've taken a perfect snapshot of the person that's on trial or did the terrible thing. That's false, but we're still asked in our societal way that we deal with things to be able to do that. So 61% of participants tend to pick one person from a series of images when asked to identify a murder, even though the target person is not present, or they're not presented in that series. So basically, we are very prone to making this judgment, identifying somebody, even if we have no reason to do such a thing. So typical errors are associated with your attention. So when you are aroused in a situation, we, again, have limited attentional capacity, so you're paying attention to maybe the most relevant information, like, am I safe? Do I need to get over here? Whatever. Things are exciting. Basically, you can't pay attention to everything at once. So, thinking that you see what color the car is that committed the accident and drove away, you might not, because you're not paying attention to that at the time. You don't have that ability to expend that those attentional resources. So especially if there's a weapon involved, you're not going to see the person's face, you're going to be seeing the weapon. So errors are also due to familiarity. So innocent bystanders are identified as offenders just because you saw them around, or know to associate them with whatever crime, and living nearby can be sufficient to be taken as an offender. Errors are due to suggestion, so asking suggestive questions, so biasing the witness. Often the police do this unintentionally, but they lead them unintentionally to conclude certain things when it's not actually true, creating this false memory. Another dangerous and unfortunate thing is that by even asking questions after an event, you make the person more confident that they know what was going on. Let's go over a couple of these. So here's that idea of familiarity. In an experimental group, people viewed a film about a male teacher reading something to students. In the control group, they viewed a film of a female teacher reading something to students. So in one group it was male, another group it was female. In the second stage, we saw the female teacher get robbed. And so then in the third stage, you're asked to test, or asked out of a lineup, who was the robber. In cases where in the experimental group, when people saw the male teacher first, they often identified it as the male teacher, even though it was not. Just because they saw that male teacher first, they concluded that that was the perpetrator when he, in fact, was not. So you can see that's pretty dramatic. It's 60% of people concluded that it was the teacher just because they saw the teacher first, versus 20 or not, in the second case, not significantly different from the control group. So people who saw the female. Basically, the guy, if they hadn't seen him before, he didn't stand out in any significant way. But if you had seen him before, your familiarity with him would lead you to think that maybe he was the perpetrator. So that kind of gets to that location problem. Say you live in an area and that's why you were the witness to some crime. If you live in that area, you're probably going to see people around you that also live in that area just in your daily tasks. If one of those people happens to be in that lineup, you're going to be more familiar with them just having been exposed to them before, so you're more likely to conclude that they were in fact the guilty person just because you've been exposed to them before, which is not great. And also, when you ask people questions after they witness something, they become a lot more confident that they really know what was going on just by being asked questions. So not necessarily even leading them one way or another, just being asked questions makes you more confident that you remember what was going on. And then you can also provide that kind of leading information, which unfortunately happens a lot of times by police officers, not intentional. But here's an experiment. They viewed videos of a crime, then they were asked to pick the perpetrator, and then they received feedback. The feedback was either, good job, you found the suspect, or you received no feedback, or you received feedback that maybe you should try again. I don't know if you got the person. Not terribly surprisingly, people are most confident if they see the information, medium confident if they, or more confident if somebody says, good job, you caught the person, makes sense. Medium confident if they don't receive any feedback, and less confident if somebody says maybe not. So that's not a very surprising experiment. At the same time, this is often what's going to happen, unfortunately, when asked things by the police officer, especially in that Stephen Avery case, the police officers were like, hey, this is a bad guy, I think maybe you should pick this guy. And the result is that she was very confident that that was her attacker. In fact, that was incorrect. So here are just a few things that can be done to reduce errors in eyewitness testimony. You can inform the witnesses that the perpetrator might not be in the lineup when you show them a lineup, to just make them aware of that. You can use fillers who are similar to the suspect. This is discussed a little bit in your book. So you can pick other people to be in the lineup. So how a lineup typically works is you've got that suspect, the one that you're hoping that they identify because your evidence leads you to believe that that's probably the person. So they're in there, and then there's a bunch of rando people in there too. If the person can identify the person that they think is that guilty person based off of their investigation, then that's kind of some confirmation that the police found the right person. So when you're using filler people, it's basically you have that suspect, and then you find people who look similar to that suspect, and you fill in that lineup with people who look the same. So you can see in your book, often police don't want to do that because they think that it's more likely, just because you're seeing like a sea of faces, that you'll pick the wrong person in that lineup and you'll say that that person's the guilty person just because they all look the same. But what actually happens, and that's true to some extent, but what also happens is that they're less likely to identify somebody as guilty just because they're seeing a lot of the same faces. Maybe they have to be more discriminating or distinguish between them. So it's kind of an interesting, science tells us that maybe this would be a better theory, but police officers are resistant to that. You can also present things sequentially, so picture, 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 person, 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 rather than having them all in the same page or in the same lineup. And you can also improve your interviewing techniques to not ask people misleading information. This is kind of what I was talking about, sorry, the effect of using filler people. So in that first, on the left image, the perpetrator was in the lineup that the participant saw. So on the y-axis, you have the proportion of witnesses who are choosing the guilty suspect. So that's the case where they're actually clearly identifying the person that was guilty. So in the low case, they had a lineup of people that didn't look similar at all. So they were a little more likely to choose the guilty person in that case, whereas they had a bunch of people presented that looked very similar. So they were a little worse at picking the right person. But then in the second group, or in the condition where you don't actually have the perpetrator, the real criminal in the room, the result is that people would just say, I don't know if that's the right person, in the condition where everybody's kind of similar. So that's kind of, in the first case, if you really think the suspect is there, you might get people to tell you, confirm, yes, I think that's the suspect, if you don't have similar looking people. But on the flip side, you might be more choosy with your information and not pick an innocent person if you see people as looking highly similar. So it's kind of interesting. That's actually what we will cover for today. It's only a few more slides. We'll just finish it up next Tuesday. Remember that you should be doing your exam. You should be writing your paper. You should just ask the questions and have a good weekend and all of that.